Morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Hammer, and today on Tonic 7, we're going to be discussing the topic of national divorce. I'll be introducing it as I had the misfortune of suggesting the topic in the first place, despite the fact that I'm not appearing in this video. So, national divorce. What do we mean whenever we're talking about this? Well, what it is in its very simplest form is the idea that you have one polity and it's going to split into two. Right? Just like a normal divorce of any other private relationship, what was one is now going to become two, as the participants decide they're better off without each other and are going to go their own way. This seems simple, so simple you might not need to have its own particular term for it, but the reason we do is what it's not. Right? It is not inherently a revolution. Revolutions usually refer to things such as taking over the original government, putting new people in power, but maintaining that same apparatus of the state. Right? The American Revolution, which we're going to be celebrating here in a few days here in the States, is kind of misnamed in that regard. Right? It wasn't so much a revolution, but as a splitting apart from the parent country. Likewise, it's not necessarily a rebellion. Could be. Things go badly. Sometimes it turns that way. But generally, a national divorce is something that's affected by some sort of parliamentary process where you might have the legislatures of the individual states or individual parts of a nation vote to leave. That goes through some sort of national process, and yada yada yada, things come out the other end. Right? If you're thinking of things like Brexit, or Scotland periodically has referendums to leave the UK, that sort of situation is what's going on there. And likewise, it isn't a civil war. Right? When we talk about national divorce, civil war might be the eventual outcome if, again, things go to hell in a handbasket. We're going to talk about that in a second. But in general, completely separate sort of situation. Right? So why is this relevant? Why are we talking about it now? And why would anybody decide to do this? Well, the biggest reason, and pretty much the reason why polities have split up historically at all, is that we have very big political differences between people and regions within a single state. Right? For those of you who read my blog, which you should, might remember an older post of mine about America being an accidental empire. And the whole point of that was that the United States, as it's constructed, is, historically speaking, one of the bigger empires in history. There's been empires that had more land space, but they usually had fewer people. There's been empires that had more people, but they were usually in a smaller geographic region. The United States is right up there when you look at it in terms of the number of people spread out over the amount of space. And that's not counting the space between California and Hawaii, we're talking just landmass. Right? And what this means is there's a lot of different cultures, a lot of different people that want to have different sorts of governments, have different senses of right and wrong, what the rules should be, what they shouldn't be, and that this tends to pull polities apart. Particularly in the case of the United States, with our federal system, one thing that's been successful for us is that the large-scale, nation-state level, our federal system has historically not been very intrusive in day-to-day lives. Right? So people in California can have different rules from people in Florida, who have different rules from people in Montana, and it's very state-based with only a light layer of federal on top of it. Past 100 years, however, we've seen increasing, not only increasing amount, but increasing rate of growth of federal meddling, basically, in state-level issues, which has caused a lot more tension. And at the same time, at the state level, we've seen a remarkable amount of people starting to self-sort in a way we hadn't seen in quite a long time, where not only do we have, if you look at the demographic movement, you see an exodus of people from blue states, especially in the last 3 years, where they'll leave California for Arizona, or they'll leave the northeast Pennsylvania, but also the northeast of the United States in general, start flowing down South Carolina and Florida. The interesting thing about this, however, is it isn't just a movement of people looking for better economic situations, more jobs, opportunities, which is pretty common at all times, but we're actually seeing people moving for political reasons. So that is, people leave New York State, they go to Florida. Florida doesn't become more blue. It doesn't start to look more like New York. It becomes more red, which implies that people in the right wing, Republicans and whatnot, are leaving in New York they no longer like and moving for a different political climate and a different set of government down in Florida. Now, this is when this gets important. So we have people that are not only culturally distinct, becoming more polarized politically overall, but they're also becoming geographically distinct. We're having people select into regions that have a closer political alignment to themselves. So we have a nation, instead of being, kind of a vague purpley color with maybe like, some little splotches of red and blue here and there, we get regions that look like very blue state, very red state, and becoming ever more so over time. Right? So both on the geographic and cultural front, we're seeing these splits. But at the same time, as the federal government's becoming more and more important, we also see that this is coming in more and more from one direction. In the United States, typically it's the left that's pushing hard to make sweeping rules at the federal level that then apply to the states. Why is that important? Well, if you can move from New York to Florida to get a better political climate that suits your preferences and sense of right and wrong, great. Problem solved, right? You didn't like one state, move to another. We're all still within the United States, but we get to kind of pick our government, right? Demo competition at its finest. However, once things start going through the federal level, we find that, well, now it doesn't matter where you live. You're going to have to live like the federal government says, and since the federal government is largely dominated by New York and California, they're going to follow you, right? So now we have a problem. You could choose your states, can't choose your federal government unless you split off and make your own. Right? So in the United States, this is the sort of thing that's starting to percolate through people's minds. It's like, well, what if just being part of the U.S. is a really bad idea overall, and it's just come time to cut ties, go our own way, start our own sort of country, that kind of idea. Right? Now, many people will talk about this as though it's the peak of madness, and actually we'll talk about that more in a second, but there's a couple different ways this could go, right? On the one hand, the ideal situation is a sort of thing you might see with maybe a Brexit, but what you might imagine if Scotland does finally vote to leave the UK, right? They vote, people agree, say, okay, well, that's what you decided to do, those are the rules, great. You get to become your own nation state again, form your new government, and things can just actually keep on going the way they were, right? You can imagine that if, Texas were to say, nope, we're going to be a republic again, boom, we're out. We're our own state. State of Texas now becomes the nation state of Texas. Wonderful. What has to change? Well, nothing really. You could still imagine they're going to have free trade relatively free trade at least, with their neighboring states. They might have treaties that allow free movement between the United States and former states of the Union, all that kind of deal. Right? There's no particular reason things have to go bad. All of the states have lots of economic ties with each other, lots of cultural ties still. It's quite reasonable to say, okay, those can just continue. You can make rules to say, yeah, we're just going to allow this sort of back and forth intercourse as though you were still part of the group, but now you're something else. Great. Less ideally, you can easily imagine, though, that the federal government or the remaining states might get a little pissy and might decide that, well, no, we're going to start leveling really high tariffs against your goods, or we're not going to allow free movement between the states like they used to, so hey, any Texans that used to travel over to Oklahoma to work, you're out of luck, sorry. Right? That can get really ugly. That can be a bit of a problem. They might have strict regulations, say, well, we don't want to have to compete with Texas on these sorts of industries, so you're out. Right? Or even less ideally, you might have a situation where the federal government decides that, nope, you don't get to leave. Right? We've had that before here, for those of you who remember your readings into the Civil War. The Union could have just let the southern states leave, but they decided not to. Fought one of the bloodiest wars in American history over the matter. And so you can get into these sort of situations, right? These kind of things can, if approached by a particularly unpleasant federal government or, nation-state level government, spiral into bloody civil war real quickly. But the example of the American Civil War should give us pause, right? The United States, that's all we care about here, let's face it. Sorry, Luke. But if the United States gets to this point, we do have this relatively recent civil war we can lean back on and say, look, we don't want to let this go to war. Let's do this peacefully, right? So why would we even think it would get that bad? Well, I'm a pessimist, so I might think, well, okay, let's see. Maybe let's just discount the idea that, any sort of politician would have some sort of power lust or venality or just be so stupid they can't prevent this from happening. Moving past that, what might make these some issues, right? Well, some big issues that we'd have to contend with would be things like who owns the national debt and how much of it, right? If 4 or 5 southern states, say the Gulf states, all decide they want to break away from the United States, going to start their own country, the Gulf state nation. Okay, sure. Texas, Louisiana, Florida, all of them, they all decide, yep, we're out. How much of the national debt do they owe? How do we figure out how much do they owe, right? Do we go back 100 years and see how many of the federal dollars got directed towards, those southern states' roles? Do we do it by head count? All of that starts getting really tricky. And when you're talking about a national debt that's bigger than the GDP of the country for a year, that suddenly becomes like a pretty big deal, right? It's a lot of tax revenue going away and a lot of debt that needs to be covered. It's unlikely the remaining states are going to share that burden. But on the other side of the ledger, we have all of the federally owned resources in these various states, right? So you have things like military bases, tanks, planes, all this hardware, right? Ships at dry dock, the dry dock itself, right? Who owns that? If Texas decides to leave, do all the M1A1 Abrams they have parked out back, do they have to be sent back to the federal government, or do they stay with Texas? Good question, right? What about all of the national park lands or federally owned land that has oil reserves on it? Right? You can imagine if Nevada leaves, well, that's going to be a real awkward situation for them since the federal government owns the vast majority of land within the borders of Nevada. Is it going to be left with just a little tiny network of roads and a few little towns and that becomes the state of Nevada? Or are they going to want all that space, right? Is there going to be a deal where Texas secedes and says, hey, United States, we'll give you back these planes and tanks that have been parked in our backyard, but you got to take it off of our share of the national debt, right? These are big issues that would need to have people coming together to actually decide. And if you find that the people on one side don't want to come to the bargaining table and actually work this out cleanly, well, just like any kind of personal divorce, you can imagine that getting really ugly really fast. So, as we're talking about this, I think one of the big questions should be, is the national divorce necessary or inevitable? Is this something that's definitely looming on the horizon? And if so, how do we keep it from turning bloody? What can we do to kind of prepare ourselves so should the situation arises, we have a good game plan, a good idea of what sort of things should be done to keep it from turning into a bloodbath that sweeps across the nation and wrecks things, and instead turns into a nice, hey look, we voted, here's your stuff, I'm taking my stuff, we're out. Right? For myself, and since this is the last thing I'll get to talk about in this conversation, too bad, I think that it's neither necessary nor inevitable, but it's very largely dependent on whether or not we can, as a people, roll back a little bit of our dependence on the federal government in terms of actually making rules for the entire nation. I think the more the nation starts to behave as one overbearing, top-down system that says, hey, I don't care which state you're in, everybody has to follow exactly the same rules, I think the less likely it is that the accidental American empire is going to be able to hang together. Unfortunately, I think that's also not likely to happen. So my guess would be, perhaps not in our lifetime, but over maybe the lifetime of our children or grandchildren, the question of national divorce is going to be raised. And so why I'm glad that we're talking about it today, because I think this is going to become a salient issue within the next 100 years or so. And it's good to have these sorts of conversations well before it happens, before it becomes a question of the turmoil and tumult of competing factions. And I'll just close out with the idea that John here might appreciate, in light of some of his latest writings, that these sorts of things take time. They can go for a very, very long time before the small sparks of stress and strain finally turn into something that has to pull apart a nation. Just sticking to our July 4th theme, it's worth remembering that Bacon's Rebellion occurred over 100 years before the American Revolution, but for the exact same reasons. So what we're seeing today might not turn into something so dramatic as national divorce, But the fact that we're talking about it at all very strongly suggests that one's in the offing. So, thank you guys, and I hope you enjoy all the rest of the conversation. Have a good one. Happy 4th of July.
So thanks to Eric for that excellent analysis. I'll just start off and say, I agree with his conclusion about the only way ahead to avoid something like this would be for the federal government to do less. I think that's really straightforward. The problem is that the people that have all the power right now on the left that are kind of accelerating is they don't understand that what they're doing isn't sustainable. I don't think that they appreciate how deeply unpopular everything, like a lot of the policies that they advance are. They don't understand populism. They think that it can be suppressed, that the popular will of the people can be suppressed in favor of institutions that are increasingly seen as corrupt and incompetent. I just don't think that it's sustainable. I think they're going to be forced to confront that reality at some point. I think that the reason that they haven't is because of, a vast AI driven censorship apparatus that's allowed them to convince themselves that, they're not in a tiny little echo chamber with the majority of Americans finding their beliefs and desires with things like the Second Amendment and First Amendment. We just saw with affirmative action, there was expected to be a big backlash over Roe v. Wade being appealed. They don't understand that it's, the majority of Americans are not with them, and that the only reason that they're able to maintain their power is through this vast censorship apparatus. But I think we have their number on that. And if we do a good job of countering that, then it's going to make it so that their departure from reality doesn't continue to expand. Because as I've kind of talked about before, the bigger the gap between reality and whatever narrative you're operating off of, the more disastrous the collapse and coming together of reality with the narrative is going to be. Like in the case that I use in late stage bureaucracy, Chernobyl was an example of that. It happened because they had departed so far from reality. But those are my opening thoughts, and I will pass it on to whoever wants to continue on the conversation.
What you said? Oh, go ahead. Who's John? Go ahead.
Ha! Beat you.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I can jump in as a non-American outside observer. On the one hand, I kind of wonder if Doc is being a little bit optimistic and sort of like pushing things out to like century timescales, because things do seem to be getting extremely unstable. This is certainly a sort of fourth turning Turchin-esque kind of period we're in right now, a crisis point. So I wouldn't really be surprised if the U.S. fell apart within a decade. But then, on the other hand, maybe it won't come to that, and it might actually be just like a sort of de facto rather than de jure separation. If you look at what's already happened in the U.S. over the last 10, 15 years, you've had an increasing tendency for states to simply ignore federal law on issues that they felt were particularly important. So you have blue states establishing themselves as sanctuary states and just ignoring federal immigration law. You have also blue states ignoring federal drug law and legalizing marijuana, despite the fact that it remains an illegal narcotic at the federal level. And you also have a lot of red states kind of ignoring federal gun laws, for example, or declaring that if they go too far, they will certainly be Second Amendment sanctuary states, things like this. And the interesting thing is that in most cases, the federal government has kind of turned a blind eye to that. Now, there's certainly the argument to be made that's because, there's elements in the federal government that agree with those policies. And that's true. But I think there's also an element of the feds don't want to push things too much because they kind of understand that actually their power is far more fragile than it is, and or it's far more fragile than it seems to be, and that if they push things too far, some governor somewhere might just say, "Well, screw this, we're going our own way. I'm making myself king," and that would. And if he succeeded in that, then others leave, and then the whole thing falls apart. So better to kind of maintain a sort of illusion of control where everyone kind of continues with a game of make believe, while increasingly power at a de facto level kind of devolves down to the levels of individual states and cities, which, if you push that process far along into the future, you end up with a kind of like a feudal Holy Roman Empire kind of situation where on paper, the United States of America still exists. It still has a Congress, it still has a president, you still have elections, so all these things. But at the level of practical everyday power, they've been completely sidelined. And what really matters is who's in the governor's mansion, who's in the state legislature, who's elected mayor of the city state, things like that. So that's one way I could see things kind of playing out. And I think that would probably in practice be acceptable enough to everyone because, who really cares what the pieties are in Washington, D.C., as long as you don't have to follow them, as long as you can kind of ignore them, as long as the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. It doesn't matter how fanatical they are in the Capitol.
What you said about
Yeah.
that, like the whole Holy Roman Empire model, I mean, that's kind of how it was supposed to be, at least originally, and it seemed like it kind of was, but over time it just got eroded, because that was original model was that it wouldn't matter if you were in a small town and, whatever state. DC really didn't have it was more foreign policy that operating the post office, things like that, printing money. But the one thing, Grant, you had mentioned that they don't realize how unpopular, divisive their beliefs or their ideologies are that they're trying to force on everybody. And I think it's true for the majority of the true believer, NPC, whatever folks. But there's some of the, I guess, psychopaths behind the scenes. They have to know, like, George Soros, right? Like this guy contributing to DA races, to try to get candidates elected that will just not prosecute crime, particularly violent crime or quality of life crimes, but will only prosecute, crimes where, against political opponents of the regime, or if anybody stands up to the criminals, like Daniel Penny did in on the subway, or the bodega owner, who was from the Dominican Republic and had been attacked by this woman's boyfriend because her EBT, food stamp card declined and he wouldn't give her the potato chips that she was trying to buy. So she brings her boyfriend up to, attack him. She's got a knife, and then he takes, I guess, the knife from one of them and stabs him in self-defense. And, he's charged. I guess due to public outcry, he was released. But, just that kind of thing where and this isn't just a one-off thing, it's like across the country, every place where this crime is out of control, there's like this Soros-funded DA behind it all, and so you say, okay, George Soros knows what he's doing. He knows he's trying to collapse the system. He knows he's going to create disorder and chaos, and maybe try to profit
Dan,
from it.
Dan,
yeah.
If society was the way you wanted it to be, social engineering wouldn't be necessary, right? So at a certain level, I think you're totally right. The social engineers have to know that their policies are unpopular.
Well, not just unpopular. I mean, in the case of George Soros, I really don't think he's trying to build society in a better way, where he's like, oh, it's going to work better for everybody, and it's going to be more just, and more, people are going to have a better quality of life, and overall people are going to be happier. Like the net utility is going to be better. I think the dude's he's trying to crash the system. He knows this will do it, destabilize and undermine, and cause the whole thing to sink and into chaos. And he's hoping, like, this is his MO, to profit off of the chaos. Dude's a freaking demon and a snake. And you multiply him by however many people in this elite circle there are, as George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. The folks that are in it, though, I mean, these are some evil motherfuckers that it's not like you got your true believers, and that's probably the majority of the folks on the left. They really do think, or really do believe whatever it is that they're, preaching. Maybe they think is more popular than it is because where they live, it is the norm for people to believe that. Or maybe they know that it's not popular in the heartland, but think they're on the right side of history. So they're going to change things, and 100 years from now, books will be written celebrating them, and they're
again, like even with the true believers, like in the foot soldiers to the left, right? Like, if you talk to them, it's really interesting because on the one hand, they'll do the whole like, oh, democracy, yay thing, but on the other, they really do see themselves as a revolutionary vanguard whose job it is to proselytize to and lead the masses, right? Who are these kind of backward, benighted, herd who need to be shown the right way to do things. Implicit in that is this recognition that the majority of people, in fact, do not hold your values, which then directly implies that your values are unpopular, that you are in the minority, and that in a democratic situation interpreted as will of the majority prevailing, you would lose, right? So I mean, that this is this kind of like schizophrenic fracture at the heart of the leftist ideology, but to a degree I think it's simply very self-serving.
They're being
if I
weaponized by
jump in for a second.
the Soros guys. Yeah, go Mark.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. You had something to respond to John too directly, so go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead.
Okay, so so one of the things that I've been grappling with lately is this concept of coherence between thought and word, let's say. So in other words, like we're all becoming a bunch of mind readers, and maybe not the most stable kind. So when we say, well, the people on this side of whatever divide, when we say they mean what they say, they must mean what they say, that is an assumption that we're making. As in relation to what Luke wrote just this morning, I think it's one of many assumptions that are kind of hardwired into us. In other words, like their incentive structures must be exactly as they say they are. And I think in 9 times out of 10 cases, that's possibly not true at all. Like I was thought of the, do you guys ever see The Dark Knight? It was the second Batman movie.
Multiple times.
And I think it begins with a heist. And essentially the elements of this bank heist or the ethos that underlies all of them is sort of hidden from every participant. So every participant in the bank heist in that opening scene believes that they have the secret information. In other words, outwardly, they're projecting this idea of team, that they're approaching this project as a team. Yet each one of those operatives on the team believes that they're the ones that know what's really going on. Despite what they say, everything else that they say is subterfuge in order to emulate the supposed outlines of this project, robbing this bank. And so I've been starting to think of people on what we call the progressive left as being maybe similar to that structure. In other words, like they all parrot the same messages, which are all, almost anti-philosophic or misophic in like in their priors. But it's sort of like what, and so we say like, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's like somebody will say something on that side of things, and you say like, well, we could easily pick that apart by logic, formal or otherwise. And so it's sort of like, and they continue to say it, I think maybe because it's more sort of, that's the externality of prayer. It's not necessarily something, it's part of the uniform. It's not necessarily what they're getting out of it, and so just to bring this back into the realm of the discussion of national divorce, and also what Danny was saying about like Soros. I said, like, okay, so suppose there is this balkanization into, I don't know, 2 or more nations, so to speak, that happens. Again, like when people talk about national divorce, I read all around. I read left and right. I read libertarian viewpoints and debates. And like what it seems like most people that say they want national divorce really want is something like federalism. That's what they really want. And if you explore and you ask them, that's what they'll describe at the end. But like the concept of national divorce, it seems to be something that's far more dramatic, which forces people to take a side, which is essentially.
I think the reason people are talking about national divorce now is because of the extremism of the other side and the intolerance of it, right? So like as long as, you know, all participants in the system, in particular those, well, I mean, really all participants in the system are sort of like willing to like live and let live, and like we don't really care what they do over there.
But they're not.
That's the point.
But I'm arguing
right?
that they're not. I'm arguing that their incentive structures are hidden from us and from each other in many cases. And so like part of the reason that I took up the pen in the first place, I think most of you guys know, is that I was concerned that maybe we weren't seeing the enemy's true face. And we weren't really considering, we were just, in other words, we were approaching it as though it was rational and logical and could be, it could be somehow like brought about to reason through debate or through even something like we're talking about here. Oh, some sort of a treaty.
Owned with facts and logic. Yeah. So I mean, this was, I guess, maybe the main critique actually I would have had with Doc's intro. It kind of touches on that. Which is, he's kind of approaching it as like, rational adults sitting down around the negotiating table, haggling over, the economically optimal utility maximization. And like, yeah, if we were dealing with like rational adults, like that would be the way to go. Unfortunately, we're dealing with religious fanatics.
Exactly. And yeah, go ahead, John. Just finish.
Yeah,
but I want to pull off of that at some point.
Well, I mean, so this, okay, so say you have like a national divorce kind of thing, right? Do the religious fanatics in the federal government and in the blue states, do they say, oh, that's fine? No, of course not, because that's less resources for them on the one hand to parasite off of, but, more fundamentally, that's people who are escaping from their cultural mission, right? Who are reversing the tide of history. This cannot be allowed. That would imply that perhaps history does not go in one direction, and that would strike at the very core of their identity. So this could never be permitted, and I think it would almost certainly lead to war as a direct consequence of that.
Yeah, eventually, and probably faster, more quickly, rather than probably, over a gradual period of time.
Probably very, very rapidly. Yes.
And part of the reason for that, I think, is that when we do that, like if we were to draw those lines as hard and fast lines, as some people seem wanting to do, like in other words, a legal, we'll say legal, I don't know, it's really meta legal sort of separation into a bunch of various states. Well, there's another question that I have is who's really in charge of those states? Like, in other words, like, and also in defining and allowing the enemy to reach its apotheosis through statehood, which is what we would be doing by drawing that line. We'd be saying you must go to this side of the line or the other side. And in doing so, I think we might be allowing them to really reach the full, fruition, for lack of a better word, of what it is they are. And what it is they are is an incentive that is unspoken, I believe, is unspoken, and really can be like, past all of the waves of pseudo sophistication and other bullshit. I think at the bottom of it is, again, envy, wrath, pride. Like we have, in other words, we will be in doing that, in creating that final separation, we will be allowing them to become an evil kingdom. And what sprang to mind was was Christ's story, his parable of the wheat and the chaff, right? You guys know the parable. And so the practical wisdom that Jesus was trying to impart through that parable was something along the lines of, when an evil person has sown our field with weeds, essentially, in the middle of the night while we were sleeping, which sounds pretty much like the story of the West for the past at least century, but I think more. And so this evil person comes in the middle of the night, sows weeds in your wheat field. And your instinct is, once you see the weeds, is to start pulling up those weeds. You know, this is the idea of inextricability, right? Your wheat, you know that this wheat will not grow as robust. It will be plagued for its development cycle. But he says, no, wait to pull the weeds until it's time for harvest, which means that we, on the one side, on the side of, let's say, the human singularity or the truth or whatever you like to call it, like it would mean that, like, it basically was saying, like, timing is everything. Like, you can't, like, you have to make sure you've developed yourself into your most possible robust form before you can harvest, and therefore yank up the weeds first and then harvest the crops. And I don't think we're there. I think that, like, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we have a lot of work to do before we be ready to extricate ourselves.
These things follow like a whole escalation, right?
Yeah, no,
There's a whole logical progression to them. So, I mean, if you had this separation, sorry, Luke, I'll let you speak in a second. I just wanted to say, if you had the separation and the other side kind of becomes like the evil kingdom, as it were, I think that would also, on the good side, help to crystallize things, because there's a lot of people who do sort of still kind of have that I just want to grill mentality, and they just want to be left alone, right? But if they then really see that, no, like, first of all, the other side is not going to leave you alone. Second of all, look at the atrocities that they're committing, like, behind their own borders, that would turn it into a religious war, I think, on both sides. So now it's not, it would, and you would almost certainly have a civil war then, because then it would not be a matter of one side trying to impose its will on the other. It's sort of both would be trying to liberate the other side, right? Anyhow, just wanted to say that. Go ahead, Luke.
yeah, no, I want to say something along the same lines, because I had a similar thought, when I heard you talk about it now, that actually it's the question is, like, I mean, I'm the diversity hire here, right? So I look from the outside on the US, but are you guys ready for that kind of thing, right? I mean, that's the question. I mean, I would include Western Europe probably too, but are we ready for that kind of stuff, right? I mean, it strikes me, and you guys have touched on this as well, right? So that it strikes me a bit as almost like a bit of a childish overreaction in a sense, right? So, I mean, not overreaction in the sense that it's not bad, like, out there, and it's not understandable, the feeling that, you want to maybe like create your own little nation or whatever, but it's childish in the sense that it's a reaction, right? It's like, you look on Twitter, oh my God, like, look what these guys are doing, so what would you like, let's separate, and if you're like in a reactive state like that, that's just not a good place to be. It's immature, and we talked with the Mind Matters guys, we talked about Ernst Jünger's work, right? And he, like, he lived through, like, he fought in World War I and lived through the Nazis, then lived through the whole, like, separation in Germany and all that, and he was all about, this idea, how can you get, like, revitalize the idea of freedom, how, because it seems to be like when you live under a crazy tyranny like that, and historically we have seen that too, you kind of, it's not enough to say, like, oh my God, I want my candy back, right? It's there's something lost, right? And it needs to be regained by a conscious struggle. People need to change. They need to develop, to wise up. It's all of that. And to my mind, only then can you hope of, like, achieving something new, something better. And so I think I liked, Mark, with what you said, like, that it's the same question basically, is, do people really understand what's happening? Do they have the inner resources? Are they, like, strong enough, and if you do it like that, just as a reaction, we've seen how that can go historically, and it does. Do we really think that a new, like a succession, it would work, in any any feasible sense? And also, another aspect might be that we just don't have any idea what's coming next, right? So it might be that external circumstances like dictate what will happen anyway. I mean, there's just so much things that could go out of hand now and at any moment, right? So, and there's a whole dynamic in the whole thing. So it might also and to handle that, again, you need that rediscovery of what it means to be free in an inner state. And I mean, you guys had it so good for so long, I mean, people have suffered through the GDR, and the Soviet system and the Nazis and all of that, and it's like, it's bad, but it can wise you up as well, right? And it's just yeah, I just wanted to make that point, that the question, are we ready for that kind of stuff, is really a good one in my mind.
But maybe, oh, go ahead, Grant.
I couldn't agree more. I think it is immature. And I equate it to somebody in a marriage, and I know, like, it's not like a social contract, like we didn't actually sign a contract and shit, but like the way that life works is we were born into a country, right? Like that's kind of where we're at, and to change that would require, like, we have this history, like hundreds of years of history, a way that it's worked well enough in the past, and just to discard it because there's a powerful faction, or say your spouse has like borderline personality disorder. It's like, how do we fix the borderline personality disorder? There's got to be a way. Focus your attention on that, and if you fail, you fail. But it's kind of like a commitment that I think that we all have to one another, not that we ever explicitly agreed to, but one that we were born into by fate, and we just got to deal with it. And I think that that's the mature response, is figure out, what is this spiritual conflict? What defines who's on each side? In my mind, I feel like there are ways to break down the postmodernist bullshit that kind of animates that side. So the people that have turned their backs on reality, there's a way that they operate. And if you pick the right level of analysis, it's not about logic and reason explicitly, but it is about attacking them using narratives, attacking them with their own principles, the principles that they purport to believe. So it gets complicated because there's sociopaths thrown in the mix. And I think that, straight up psychopaths that don't experience empathy exist, and they tend to get concentrated in positions of power given the current system. And that's what Harrison writes all about, right? That's what pathocracy is and ponerology. But normal people, the vast majority of people, and a lot of the people that are on the other side of this, are neurotypical deep down. Like, they have the capacity for empathy. And a lot of people, that's where this all started, is like a desire for egalitarianism, seeing people suffer, not liking it. But what it is essentially, there's a bunch of competing narratives. Like, that's how our psychology works. We have narratives that govern the way we interact. I think the reason our enemies are so crazy is because they have narratives in their head that conflict with one another. And they also conflict with reality more dramatically than others. So like, when unforeseen things happen that don't comport to their narrative, that causes cognitive dissonance. Anytime they're confronted with evidence that they have one narrative that conflicts with another, that causes cognitive dissonance, causes mental illness. And so it's not that they lack the capacity to be normal, healthy, productive people that aren't on psychotropic meds in order to get through the day. It's that we don't have the right social technologies, or we've lost them, and a lot of those are based in, traditionalism. And this is like the whole tearing down of Chesterton's fence, where like traditional values a lot of times corresponded to, healthier narratives that aren't going to conflict with reality so obviously, even though they're not like, they're not necessarily reality. It's not necessarily truth, because no narrative that you have in your head corresponds perfectly to truth. I think that just perhaps that's what this all comes down to. And if we can really understand that and learn how to communicate better, then we can avoid, the kind of outcomes that Luke's talking about, which I think people trivialize the degree to which, you don't give up a means of connection. Don't give up a potential shared identity that allows us to connect and be stable. And I think being American is one of those things that we don't want to just discard so easily, just because we're frustrated with one another, and it appears that there's no way we'll ever cut through the bullshit. Daniel.
Well, you brought up some stuff about the psychopathy and the and bringing it back to the analogy of a divorce between a couple. I mean, it's always, you have, on the one hand, you have the no fault divorce, and it's like people just getting divorced because oh, my needs aren't being met, or for trivial reasons that previous generations would just work through, and it would be better for the the family unit, the kids, the larger community, all that, if people try to stay married in those situations and work through their stuff. But then you have situations where you have a psychopath, narcissist, whatever, that is not like a normal marriage, and the normal rules really don't apply. And like in our culture, we've highlighted male psychopathy so much, and so people would be alert to that, like the guy standing up and like a Hitler type, screaming and shouting and wanting people thrown in extermination camps and whatever, right? But we haven't focused on the feminine psychopathy as much, and this a feminized version of psychopathy and narcissism that's taken over and is just as destructive, but is more subtle. And so similarly in a marriage where you have a female narcissist or psychopath, all the norm, it's kind of one of those things where divorce sucks for everybody. And it's to say this is somebody who is divorced, but sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's the alternative, it's just the best of a bunch of bad possibilities. All of the possibilities kind of moving forward are bad. You can't go back to the image that you thought it was. It's kind of, if you stay, it's going to just get into worse dysfunction, worse, for everybody, a thing that the psychopath or the narcissist is going to, that it's so harmful to everybody else involved that the best thing to do is to remove the psychopath. And it's like, if there's not a way to do that for whatever reason, sometimes the best thing, to separate and put some barriers between yourself and the psychopath. Now, in the case of the red states, like Mark brought up, I don't know that, there couldn't be a manipulation of the state level governments, but that's why I think I've come back to the founders' underlying vision, and the good of that, which is, there's two reasons to support like a democratic style government. One is thinking, oh, everybody needs to have their voice heard because they're so well informed and so their opinion is so valuable, and that's bullshit. But the second is because people are so inherently corruptible that you have to break up concentrations of power to limit bad actors' ability to hijack them, the levers of power, and use them to inflict harm on others. And the situation we see now is we've had the centralization of government and control. Now it's not just on the national level, on the global level. Look at COVID and the response to that, and how remarkably uniform, all the different nations' responses to COVID were. It was like almost like they all synchronized it at a global level, right? So it's like we have to break up these concentrations of power. I don't know what the best way to do that is. I don't think, given the current system, the psychopaths that are currently running, the nation and these globalist organizations like the WEF, I don't think they're going to just let us have our place and put up these firewalls to prevent them from harming us. And I think it is going to take a real divorce. And I wish it didn't. I know that's going to suck, and who knows, we're entering like a area of real chaos and unpredictability if that happens. But as it is now, it's like we're in a fight, and we have the WEF has us in a chokehold, and is going to choke us out, and then it's game over, right? So it's either that or the possibility that we introduce something that's going to cause chaos, like in a fight, if somebody's got you in a chokehold, maybe throw both you and your opponent down a flight of stairs, and it may knock you out, and then it's game over, or you may knock them out. It's like just introducing that possibility that things could not wind up in such a bad place for you. And I think that's where we're at here, where I would like to believe there's a way forward to work within the system and all that. I just don't see, I'm not advocating people initiate it, but I just looking at the way things are going, I don't see this turning around before it gets to a point where, we're really faced with a USSR or Maoist China style, communism here. And, that would be a fate worse than death. So, anyway, I'll cede the floor to whoever is next. I think John had his hand up.
Yeah. So when Luke was kind of saying that it seems kind of immature, I kind of agree. But it seems to me that the immaturity is this sort of refusal to deal with reality, right? So we have this sort of very illegitimate system. I think in the US after 2020, it's very difficult to sort of continue believing that if you just vote harder, you can control the federal government. I think everything that's happened from 2016 through now has demonstrated that democracy is a dead letter in the US. And so then, I think the national divorce thing comes into this sort of impulse to just kind of walk away because that is how you avoid conflict. But this ignores the fundamental nature of what Saldo calls turbo America. The US does not leave other countries alone, right? It's always actively subverting them and trying to control their internal politics and so on. So, if you had like a bunch of like coalition of southern and heartland states kind of break off and go their own way, assuming they even succeeded in that, they would be treated exactly the same way as any other hostile foreign state by Washington, which means that you would be constantly dealing with subversive influence operations, attempted color revolutions, the whole panoply of economic hitman tactics. They would not leave you alone. You would not escape all of the things that you're trying to escape at all. The fundamental problem that you have this poisonous pathocracy which has taken hold in Washington, and until it's rooted out, you're not going to have any kind of peace. So, is the mature solution to try and walk away, or is it to do what is necessary to remove that? And if it can't be removed through voting, and I think that's very clear, then you have to start thinking more fundamentally about power and how power works. Doc earlier was kind of saying, well, what would you do about in a national divorce situation about military equipment, like all those tanks and fighter jets and so on federal military bases in the secessionist states. And my first thought was, well, you grab that and dare them to take them away. Like it's force majeure. This is ours now. Like ultimately that's how power works. And And I think it's kind of maybe going to come down to a similar thing. It's going to be like whoever manages to wrest control of the system and establish a new form of legitimacy. One thing on democracy also in this kind of realpolitik, to my mind, the justification for some level of democracy has always been simply balance of power, that it is much easier to count to count raised hands than it is to count severed heads, as it were. So, you sort of take a poll of the population, and whichever side is biggest, you go, okay, you guys get your way, because the alternative is to fight it out, and then a lot of people die potentially. You don't necessarily want that. But of course, historically, the successful democratic systems have generally been the ones that strongly restricted the franchise to violence capable males with some degree of economic influence on the society. People who had actual measurable power and who should be kept happy. Slaves and freedmen and women did not get a vote. Foreigners did not get a vote, right? It was just people who could knock heads you gave a vote to as a purely practical matter. I think that's one of the problems we have now in this democratic system, actually, is that the franchise has been so diluted that there's a real sense of frustration amongst a huge number of people in the US and in other countries around the world, for that matter, where they cannot influence things democratically in any meaningful way. And as that continues, especially to the degree to which that population that gets frustrated is precisely the violence capable population, eventually, maybe they say, all right, well, we're just going to do it the old fashioned way then. So I don't know, I'm probably venturing into dangerous territory where it's very, very difficult not to when you're talking about something like national divorce. But I've also been, Kryptos' recent article about revolt and revolution through the lens of Jacques Ellul has me kind of thinking on these lines, right? So basically what I'm getting at is, like, is the mature option national divorce, or is the mature option revolt and revolution and seizing power and elevating, Red Caesar? I don't really know the answer to that, but
I think that, frankly, the mature answer can be found in Etienne de la Boissie's discourse on voluntary servitude, which was written 500 years ago. He had it down. He understood this notion that yes, of course, revolution seems so promising and so romantic and so final, and it's none of those things. Instead, what happens is nobody ends up with what they wanted at the end of these things. If we look at it now, I had there was a lot of things I wanted to cover, including Dan's, I thought, excellent analogy, but incomplete analogy, when he was talking about, so you're in an abusive marriage with an abusive spouse, and it's getting dangerous. There are things that are happening that are spinning out of control. And so you say, okay, this needs to end. This current state of affairs can't proceed as it has. It's not safe for any of us, physically or spiritually, right? And so then you get the divorce. But the divorce isn't usually not the end of it. And I don't know how many of you are boxing fans, but do any of you remember a boxer named Edwin Valero? He was a Venezuelan boxer. He was a two-time champion in two different weight divisions throughout the aughts, essentially, throughout from 2001 to 2010. This guy was dominant. And I used to write, believe it or not, for a popular boxing blog. I was a commentator, and I'm sort of an analyst, and somebody that came afterwards to say, okay, what did we just see here? What did we just see there? I wrote quite a bit about Edwin Valero back in the day, because he was someone that was constantly quite obviously physically abusing his wife. And it was getting very scary. And I told my readers, I said, like, I think this is going to end quite badly. Because what happened was he moved from population to population. He started out in Venezuela. He was beating this woman in Venezuela. He left for Cuba. He was beating this woman in Cuba, throwing her down flights of stairs, all of those things that we're talking about. And so I said, like, this is going to end quite badly because they keep excusing this person. They keep pushing him right along until he will murder her. And that's exactly what happened after they divorced, after the final straw, when she was in a hospital, essentially on a ventilator for a while, busted up beyond belief. And so what happened was they forgave him one last time, and then he killed her. And so the moral of this story to me is that this idea of a national divorce, right, will invent exactly the kind of the fullest version of that enemy, right? We all know the stories about, like, some of these past versions of purges and political uprisings and their reactionary states. We know tales of people getting their tongues pulled out, people being burned at the stake. And, like, we are fools to think that this could not happen with this crowd, because what we would be in drawing those hard battle lines of a national divorce, and they would be battle lines, no matter what we thought of it, no matter what agreements we thought we had reached with these people. Ultimately, I think what would happen is they would cross those lines. They would come for us. And here's a reason why. Think about who would be on that side of that line. Think who you would be almost driving there. You would be driving people who are heavily in favor of abortion on demand. You'd be driving the rainbow crowd, most of whom are non-reproductive. So you'd have a labor crisis, you'd have a population crisis, you'd have a competence crisis beyond what you would ever what was imaginable before. This would supersede all of that. This would expand beyond anything of our imaginings. This would be a nation of rolling blackouts and food shortages and constant rage. And so my question is not, can that be done or should it be done? My question is, would we be ready to do it by the time we drew those lines? That's a real strategic question. That's a pragmatic question. I'm not saying that a national divorce isn't conceptually, at least, it makes sense conceptually, but pragmatically, it's sort of like, once that Rubicon is crossed, you are unleashing hell on one side of that divide. And are you ready to confront hell? And as I look amongst the black-pilled masses and the various gray-pilled and all of these other elements of the dissident right, I'm saying, like, we have not got our shit together yet. We really haven't. We're not really ready. We think we are because, again, to be on the side of the righteous is to think, like, well, okay, so, like, God will provide is sometimes what we think. But again, like, the God that I'm coming to know knows that we need to provide for ourselves as well. That we can't, if we're going to do something, strategy must be a part of it. It must be. We can't just ignore it and just flippantly say it'll all work out in the end. And I realize maybe I'm a heretic for saying that, but I really do believe that part of what's going on here is that we were given minds for a reason. And part of that mind was to say, let us exercise judgment and prudence. Let's look at the situation realistically in a way that our enemy can't, and then decide when best to act. So if we move too prematurely and saying, like, okay, we're going to go have our freedom-loving civilization over here, and all the tyrants and their thralls will be on the other side, they will come for us. They'll come for our children in a way, in a lot of very real ways, in the sense that, like, again, it's sort of like you have a barren population on one side where the clock's ticking. And when they say things, when they march under those banners and they say things like 10% is not enough, groom, 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 or where they actually say, we're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children, it's like, why don't we take them at their word for that? They're saying that you people are the baby creators and we want the product because the product is important to reify identity or whatever.
Yeah,
And I'm like,
liberals don't have kids, don't have their own kids. They have yours, as the saying goes.
right.
Yeah, but I mean, this is kind of
That's
what I
what
was
I'm getting
getting.
at.
This is what I was getting at. Like everything you're saying there it is like, so okay, you have this national divorce, you have this secession movement. Great, okay, and you think they're going to leave you alone? Like I don't think they will, right? I think you're exactly right about that. Which then sort of changes the calculus in terms of, okay, what is the actual strategic move to be made here? And like this, in a sense, like this whole conversation we're having here is part of a very old conversation that goes back a long time in the American political tradition, particularly on the right, where you can find people kind of like LARPing about like what would happen in the new like red versus blue civil war or whatever, you know, like 10, 20 years, 30 years back. And one thing that's kind of perennial in that is that the combat experience and the sort of consumer firearms are pretty much entirely on the red side of the ledger. And that's become something of a joke in recent years because, nothing has happened, right? So like everyone kind of like laughs at conservative Americans like, oh, you guys are you guys are never going to do anything. It's all just talk. But I think there's an element there of precisely this kind of maturity that you were talking about, Mark, where precisely because you have so many combat veterans in Red America, they know what that looks like. Like a lot of these guys, they have been to these third world shitholes. They have seen what civil conflict turns into, how ugly it gets, right? Uh, they know what it means when you can't get medicine, when the power is only on for a couple hours a day, if you're lucky, when potable water is a scarce resource in the city, when ethnic conflict is escalated to the level that people are getting burned alive in the public square. They've seen this kind of thing or the fallout from it, and they do not want to go there. They don't want that happening in their own country. So they're kind of in this situation where if they chose as a group to escalate to the level of armed conflict, they would almost certainly win. But they know the price that would be paid by them and by everyone else would be so terrible that they don't go for that nuclear option. And then the result, though, is that the left just pushes and pushes and pushes and pushes because they do not have this level of maturity. They don't really, they're like a child poking at a bear that is well mannered enough that it doesn't really want to kill the kid by swatting it, but at the same time, it's getting really annoyed, you know? So then, the bear kind of thinks like, well, maybe if I just wander over to that other part of the forest and this annoying kid will leave me alone. But then the kid doesn't leave him alone. That's kind of, so, yeah, I mean, I think the whole national divorce question, it really comes down to, it's almost like this sort of last ditch sort of thought experiment that conservative America is running with itself, where, because they had the Hail Mary pass with Trump in the Flight 93 election. They saw how that worked out. The other side just, ended up just blatantly stealing the 2020 election, just in broad daylight, hands right in the cookie jar, looking into looking everyone right in the eye and saying, "Oh no, we didn't steal anything." And it's like, okay, well, they're not. They'll just keep doing that since they had no consequences for it. So you're not going to vote someone in again. Like that's just not happening. That's been closed off. All right. Well, the only other option to avoid armed conflict at this point would be secession. But wait, is that actually even plausible? Would the other side leave you alone? The answer, when you think about it for more than a few seconds, is no, they would not. They absolutely would not. So yeah, it's
And in that sense, we need to. That means we need to get our shit together. It does mean that the impetus is on us. Like, the interesting thing is that we're equipped to handle that responsibility, or we found our way there. Some of us, but it's sort of like there's this trepidation. There's this idea that, like, maybe we could get out of this somehow. Like, maybe somehow. And that's magical thinking. It's magical thinking.
It's a stage of the grief, right? It's
correct.
Like,
yeah.
Denial, bargaining, right? Like we did, and it's
And so I think what we should be doing more than engaging in fantasy. Wait, I see Grant's hand is up. Actually, let me go to Grant. Let's go to you. It's been up there for a while, but
So it's a false dichotomy. Like, this idea that since the 2016 election and like Trump wasn't able to accomplish much, and then 2020 was stolen. Oh, therefore they'll always be stolen. So just give up and don't take the only fucking course of action that is the way through this. So the idea that we don't have any political solutions when the strategic engagement on the enemy's side was pervasive and like all across the board. Mark Elias going state to state, changing state election laws, like the degree to which they were coordinated, the COVID-19 pandemic allowing for mass mail-in balloting, the billions of dollars coming from elaborate fraud schemes that had huge setup horizons like FTX. Like, the idea that the enemy can just replicate that over and over and over again in the face of opposition is absurd. I mean, they barely won. And with all that and with virtually no opposition. So just to say, oh yeah, now the only choice is national divorce or violence, I think it's silly. I think that we have not tried to strategically engage in the political sphere in a manner that's anywhere close to effective, anywhere close to the scale. And frankly, I don't think that we would have to at the scale that the enemy's been able to. I think that we could do it at a fraction of the scale. And since we're, essentially the rules, it's democracy, and we're dealing with a huge asymmetry in what is popular. Like, there's a political way to do it. It's like, people aren't even fucking trying, frankly. Just accepting the uniparty false dichotomy between Republican and Democrat, thinking that Republicans don't fix their own primaries to pick establishment candidates that are going to be sympathetic to the regime. Like,
don't you think that's somewhat changing, though, Grant? I've got a sense in the last year and a half that's changing. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Is it's changing. I'm involved. If I'm involved, then there's a lot of people that are involved. I know other people that are involved. People are frustrated, and like, especially on the veteran side, like John said, people that really understand that we don't want this to come to a violent conclusion. Understand that it's now or never, that if we don't go all in on trying to find a political solution, then we are fucked, And so, like, will it be hard? Yeah. Is it possible that we're not going to be able to figure out a way through? Yeah, that's always possible. But to just like this attitude on the dissident right that, oh, well, they stole it, and so they're always just going to steal it, so I guess I might as well not vote. Like, the enemy wants that more than anything. That's all they need. All they need is for you to be demoralized and give up.
I certainly wouldn't say that no one should vote. I think that's retarded.
But it's
a weapon in the arsenal.
Yeah,
it's a weapon in the arsenal. I would more say that, like, given the brazenness with which they acted in 2020, the probability that they will do the same in subsequent elections is very high. So one should not rely on that strategy alone, which I don't and you weren't saying that anyone should. Obviously, like, you press forward along multiple strategies or along multiple vectors of attack. And you always look for the peaceful political ways of achieving your goals before relying on armed violence, obviously. I think in a sense, like actually I think the dissident right is getting more mature about this. So rather than exclusively trying to rely on electoral politics, there's an increasing focus on economic power, on cultural power, meme power, like winning hearts and minds, as the phrase goes, removing the moral and political legitimacy of the regime insofar as it does manage to cling to political power through dirty means. You sort of point that out to people, you make it seem, okay, you're not really legitimate. Which is much
they all feed in. They all feed
exactly. They all feed in. They absolutely all feed in.
So it's a part of it.
Yeah.
The electoral politics thing is a part of what creates dilemmas for the enemy. So like that's the easiest way to conceive of it. Like it's a battle of will, and they have strategic objectives. They are very good at deploying large pools of capital and leveraging the legal system as it is in order to achieve their ends. And we just need to do the same things in accordance with our principles. And it just so happens that our principles, I believe, conform better to reality. The narratives that we operate under are closer to reality. To give one example, the fact that we acknowledge that there are differences between individuals, there are differences between men and women generally. That's just a small example of something that's like it's pervasive across the board with the narratives that govern our side versus the enemy's side. And if we can put the same energy into combating the enemy, so that we can achieve what we want, which is freedom, like negative freedoms, essentially living in accordance with natural law, then I think that we're going to be successful without violence. I think
it's still very possible. I mean, the way that I see there being success non-violently is how the Soviet Union came down in the Eastern Bloc more generally, which actually wasn't entirely non-violent. I mean, you had some executions, you had some, tanks rolling on Moscow, but by and large, it was surprisingly bloodless. And it all came down to just a total public collapse in faith in the institutions and the legitimacy of the government.
Yeah, but there was an underlying structure in place there, John. Like the fallback was what? GAE. The fallback was global homo. The fallback,
yeah, but to a degree, right? I mean, you also had so in the case of Czechia, for instance, you have the parallel polis, which was kind of a homegrown thing. In the Soviet system, the fallback was gangsterism and whatever remnants of the Soviet system.
Correct. Who were linked into that global homo network.
Absolutely.
Who were part,
Absolutely.
And so like that, even though
so what's the fallback for us, right? So, we have whatever homegrown things we're able to put together. And then you have, frankly, foreign, but in the case of the US, I think it's a little bit different, right? So in the Soviet Union, you had this totalizing ideology that had completely dominated the country for almost a century and had all but wiped out all public traces of the previous political order. In the US, we have this very strange hybrid system where you have the old republic, right? The US Constitution and federalism and all of that, which is, publicly paid lip service to by the regime and, privately is very dear to the heart of a majority of the American population, at least half of it. And then you have, this has been hybridized with the kind of second constitution, the civil rights kind of constitution that came out in the 1960s. And that's, your affirmative action, and it's culminated in wokeness, and, this is, and so there's this tension in the US is kind of the point, which is kind of very different from what you had at the end of the Soviet system.
Yeah,
So
I think there's tension, but I think that I wouldn't sign on to that exact paradigm split with the Civil Rights Act, because that was passed, so that's constitutional now. So like if you want to say there's a split, I think it all comes down to censorship and AI driven censorship and the way that populist voices are censored. So it's like you said about lip service, right? So like this is the situation that we're in. I think it's really comes down to this, and if we can get past it, then we're going to be victorious. I think that the legitimacy that the current regime thinks that it has is all dependent upon censorship and censoring populist voices. So I think populist voices on both the right and the left you add them together and they're massively demotic. So like the vast majority of Americans are either populist right or populist left at their core, even if they can't articulate exactly what that means. And those voices are being systematically suppressed, and the narratives that support those positions in the minds of the populace are being suppressed using proxies. So initially the proxy was Russian disinformation. And so that proxy of Russian disinformation, when they say, hey, we got to censor Russian disinformation, what they were really talking about in the 2015 to 2016 timeframe was we have to silence populist voices. And in the censorship apparatus, this is all listed out. Like they specifically target populist voices. Now, the predicate, the justification for that censorship has to do with national security. Oh, well, we can't let Russians control our elections, right? Then we've lost our country. It's critical to national security. We got to censor it. And that's persuasive to people that don't know better once you lay that predicate out. And it definitely, like you have to have that in the liberal West because freedom of speech is part of what we do. And if the government is violating the First Amendment rights of Americans, everybody kind of senses that that's unacceptable. But if they're silencing dangerous misinformation that is coming from the Russian government for the reasons of national security, it's okay. So I think if people understand this game, then it all becomes very clear. And the next one's the democracy predicate, where they supplant the collective will of individuals, where it's like, hey, what's popular with individuals, to the collective will of institutions, democratic institutions, right? Which is all the ones that they control. So anybody that advocates for a policy or supports a narrative that undermines legitimacy of those institutions, well, they're enemies of democracy and they got to be suppressed. So it's like, if people can just understand this game that's being played by these postmodernist shitweasels and the policy apparatus of censorship, I really don't think it's that complicated. You wrap your head around that, and I think that's the end of the game, because then
did you guys see, like, speaking of censorship, and Grant, I totally agree that this is very central to preference falsification and consent manufacturing. Did you guys notice what happened on Twitter yesterday?
Yeah, that's related, because
that's 100%.
everything that was being scraped, like that's one of the principal mechanisms by which they control narratives.
Exactly.
They
so there is
models for like what the narratives are, how they spread.
That's the training data for the machine learning models, which are used to identify social media nodes that are spreading malinformation or what have you. And
now you guys know why I'm always saying get the fuck off of Twitter.
Yes.
What the fuck are we doing on Twitter?
On a daily basis, I think Mark was right.
But I found like Elon Musk's reaction to this intriguing, because basically, well, I mean, someone tweeted out like an analysis, just like sort of describing how this scraped data is used to feed the machine learning systems that are used for censorship, the censorship Death Star, as he put it. And then, Elon Musk responded with a bullseye emoji. So, I think he understands how this is being used, and he's and Twitter is like kind of the website they like to use to do this because it's all open. There's no strong split between users and audience there. Everyone is both. So it's very useful for tracking narrative emergence and social networks, social like network graphs and things like that. And Musk has taken that over. He seems to be interfering with the establishment's censorship apparatus quite a bit, and becoming more sophisticated in how he does it, which is causing disruptions at Twitter, which is annoying in the short term. But so I mean, I bring all this up because like that kind of gets back to that point again about power. What is power? It's not just voting, of course, and I think moves like that are the kinds of things that actually could prevent violence in the long run, because if he can sufficiently interfere with the regime's ability to manage the narrative, then their ability to escalate and defend their legitimacy and silence opposing voices and all of it starts to degrade very rapidly. Just like in the Soviet Union, you had the inability of the FSB to prevent, or the KGB to prevent samizdat from circulating, which basically gradually or prevent Radio Free America from broadcasting across the border, things like that. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying so. I'm not saying that it will definitely come to violence. I think that's a strong possibility. I sort of think of it this way, to go back to the whole like national divorce thing in general. If you look at almost any national liberation movement in history, and arguably the populist struggles in America and in the West right now are in fact national liberation struggles, because most of our countries have been taken over by this kind of globalist serpent elite, this dark brotherhood of reptiloids who have like sort of slimed their way into power and just subverted everything and kind of conquered us through the back door. And now we've all found ourselves subject to this thing that we don't control, and it sucks. And we want to free ourselves. So it's national.
The weeds in the garden, that were planted while we were sleeping.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so my point is that like our instinct is to grab these weeds and pull them out, and we're going to throw away the wheat with the chaff. And like that's what I see mostly with this national divorce debate, which seems at times to me to be childish, but or delusional, where I'm just sort of like, no, we're just waking up. Like I have a feeling so many of us are just waking up, myself included. I'm not excluding myself from that group. I'm not somebody that has been long awake. It's
interesting because that's like that. The people are waking up, and there's so many people are waking up. So I've been hearing that actually both on right and left kind of sources for like a long time now, like over a decade. Man, I think it's actually been continuously true that entire time, because it is this sort of like exponential process, or in practice, self-limiting by population size, so it's an S curve, but whatever. The point being that we're still in this phase, and have been for years and years now, where at any given time there are more people who have recently kind of had their eyes opened than there were before. So it's continuously, but for people who have been kind of like really paying attention for like many years, sort of like it's like yeah, people are waking up. But I think there is truth to that. The thing is, you get to potentially a certain level of that, and you can have a kind of mass refusal to continue the way things are, which is kind of how the Soviets were brought down. Maybe that could happen here, and it's possible we're seeing the first signs of that. You got some legal victories, like in the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action, for example. You've got all of these parent Soviets who were, like pushing back hard against the rainbow stuff in the elementary schools and the high schools.
Yeah, they in the Soviet system, they didn't have a political means of fixing it. Like we do. It's in place. We just got to use it aggressively. It like the Soviets, it was kind of like all or nothing. They didn't have this stepwise, they didn't have political freedom. Or
I
even
think the
notion.
Soviets, well, I mean, the Soviets did have more than we often credit them with. So it was a one-party state explicitly, yes. But then again, America is an implicit one-party state. But you could join the party, you could work your way up inside the party, and a lot of the dissidents actually were party members who were sort of like working against it from the inside. So there were avenues that you could use in the Soviet system to exercise some degree of pushback. But I don't disagree that it was much more controlled than the American system, because the Russians have always been more top-down authoritarian.
What you guys were saying about people waking up, more en masse. I mean, I think the worst thing that ever happened to whatever this you want to call it, the globalist regime, the worst thing that happened was that they got what they wanted, everything they wanted in 2020, and it was like a Pyrrhic victory, because it really, wakened a lot of people from their dogmatic slumbers of thinking, everything's okay, and things are just still functioning the way they always have been. It's like, it's a real wake-up call. And one of the things, I guess, if we can get past, because this is going to be a big thing, some of the 2024 election, it's going to be kind of a make or break thing in some ways, or it could be, because I mean, just depending on how it goes down, and we're at a state where there's so much kindling that's built up that a match could really set it going. And if we can get past that, the long term I think looks good, because the left, they're not having kids, and also the kids today, for them, used to be that it was exciting or heterodox or edgy to be on the left, and now it's like that's the most stodgy, square, conformist thing you could be. So the kids, I mean, I got a couple of middle schoolers, well, one's going into high school, and just seeing my own children at entering the teenage years, and some of their friends and cousins, and it's like for them, if you're a free thinker or heterodox or rebellious, you go to the right, because that's where the interesting action is. And so that's something, they've lost that energy that they had, in the 60s. A lot of the counterculture that was on the left, it seemed cool because, you had great music, you had, interesting literature or art or whatever. And it's like, you have none of that on the left today, so long term, I think that looks really good. It's just, you got the next few years where, if we can get through the next couple of election cycles, without things going to shit, it may look good, long term. One of the other things that hasn't been mentioned yet is the financial system and the role that plays. I think a lot of the anger, it's like when things are corrupt and things work, people can put up with some corruption. It's like if that the mayor is on the take, skimming off the top, but the city basically works, it's like people will look past that or be willing to tolerate it a lot more than if everything's just dysfunctional and the mayor's obviously incompetent. And and so we see that in the country as a whole, like post, beginning with obviously there's incompetence going back even further, but with the Iraq war and the lies that was sold to us using, and how expensive that was, and then followed up by the financial crisis and the way the banks got bailed out and nobody else did, and there was just this new normal of the Fed just printing money and giving it to the banksters, and meanwhile it's like the regular people are making do with less and less. As I guess Harrison had the article recently about the reviewing Peter Turchin's book, where he's talking about the precariat class. More and more people find themselves in that, with fewer long-term economic prospects, more debt, and seeing how rigged the system is, and then two, how dominant the financial system is, which doesn't produce anything, it just extracts wealth, so somehow that's got to get fixed, where there's got to be in it, with all the debt in the system, that's going to be tough, and
Yeah, so I was about to say, Daniel,
go
like,
ahead.
is it even wealth that they're extracting, or is it IOUs? Like I had in New York City, for example, they just launched a program where they have a system of vending machines around the city now that are dispensing Narcan and crack pipes, and soon they're going to be dispensing syringes. And so, like, I'm saying to myself, okay, so this system is funded supposedly, right? In other words, because the addicts are allowed to go up to the system and just get it for free. They could just say IOU, literally, and put in any name, Mickey Mouse, whatever. Anyway, so that's our system. That's like a microcosm or a fractal echo of what's happening, right? Where it's sort of like we say that they're seizing our wealth, but we don't really have wealth.
Well,
What they're seizing is promissory notes. Yeah.
Somebody's producing it. I mean, because there's like some goods and services like that go into like making this crack pipe that's in the vending machine. I mean, just as an example.
Absolutely.
So there's real goods and services, and somehow we're just printing a bunch of money, and the people that get the money, they're using that to pay for real goods and services that other people have to produce, and so that is extracting wealth.
Anyway, it's extracting time. It's extracting time. Like, I agree. Like, which is a kind of wealth. But like, I guess my point is, okay, so like, I agree with you guys in general that you should still, that voting is not worthless, right? On the surface of it, I say like, yeah, of course you should vote. And then but to steel man that just a little bit, let's look at the other side of it. The other side says, why would you do that? Why would you, this is a Janus-faced demon, this whole Republican Democratic supposed divide in the country. They will say, no, these are two sides of the same evil coin. And why would you promote either one of them? Because eventually what they're going to do is point that and say, you've already legitimized what I was going to do anyway. And I can remember times in my life where the Republicans held the executive and the legislative bodies. And I thought to myself, okay, so what are you going to do with it? You going to do something now? And you know what? Every time I saw that, no, what they're going to do is they're going to do the same thing that every faction of our so-called government, or every so-called faction of our government does every time, which is expand their powers, pay off friends and protect them, punish enemies. It's sort of like there's a point, in other words, there's a part of me that says, I get people that say, no, you're not getting my vote, because my vote will just be used against me at a certain point. Because at a certain point, my vote will be used to say, well, you legitimize this with your vote. I get that. I get the idea that people are
in rather than not.
Right. Well,
dude,
right.
Dude, it's not, but that's like, I get it, because I've probably held that position before, but it's like if you get robbed at gunpoint and they're like, you have a choice, you give me your wallet or your watch. And you decide, and they're like, okay, well, you decided to give them your watch, and so therefore you consented, and that was a legitimate transaction. It's like, give me a break. That's not the case. It's should be understood that you're choosing from the available options. But with respect to like picking between two faces of the same demon, like that's why getting involved in the primary process and trying to break the rigid systems by which establishment candidates are selected in the primary process for both parties and name the state, right? So that you can end up with the ability to choose an individual. It's not like the parties that are the solution. It's going to be individual candidates that have solid character.
I agree. I'm trying to steelman it. Yeah.
So, I mean, the corruption though in the elections is it can be a huge issue. You can have it, so in the red states, right? You can have like fairly clean election laws and good oversight and all of that. And look at this, like overwhelmingly for the red candidate. And then you have your blue states where it's as corrupt as all hell. And they cover the windows so you can't see the vote, and they won't let observers from either side in to look at it. And the drop boxes, and just we all know, like, all the things they were doing, and it's all totally legal according to blue state election regulations. So then, the red states look at that and they say, well, you guys are cheating and making the cheating legal. You're rigging the system so you keep winning, and that, I think, it makes it very difficult for that system to remain legitimate, of course. But then the problem is that because they have participated in it, as like Mark was saying, they've legitimated the system in the first place. I don't know. I mean, honestly, as a Canadian, like I think you guys are kind of lucky in the fact that you even are having this conversation at such a in such a vigorous way at the national level. Like here in Canada, my God, man, it's so much worse.
Yeah,
Like
you guys are boned.
we are,
I would not be
we
as
are,
optimistic. Like
dude. It is. Well, there's no real prospect for, like, no one's even talking about national divorce seriously. That's not even really on the menu. There's no energy there. And then, like, in terms of, like, getting good people into parliament, like don't make me laugh. Like, we have a separatist party in Quebec, which isn't even trying to separate anymore. We have a far left party. We have another far left party. We have a third far left party, and then we have a left of right of left of center party. And like those are our options. And oh yeah, there's the People's Party of Canada, which is kind of like some little like weird graft between Trump populism and libertarianism, which has so far managed to fail to put a single member of parliament into Ottawa. So, like, I mean, there's
And
no
you have
real.
something like the truckers protest, which I
Yeah.
would say is something like that. You have something in Canada that's more like civil disobedience and parallel systems.
That was such
Thinking.
that was such a bolt out of the blue. Like that was so completely out of national character. Although I'm actually, I say that as an Ontarian because we tend to be very go along, get along here. But now that I think about it, the truckers' protest was launched from the Western states, who actually do have a tradition of sort of grassroots populist resistance to centralized social engineering authority. It goes a long way back to like the farmers' associations of the early 20th century, social credit movement, things like that. So maybe that was kind of an international character, but still, like that was
And it was
completely.
effective.
It was
Effective.
it was incredibly effective. Yes, yes. It got the government to change policy. Now, mind you, the principals who were involved in that are paying the price to this day. Their bank accounts were shut down, thrown in jail. Like, this is bad. I mean, pretty badly persecuted. So, I mean, the government got
That's
its
the price. That's the price.
That is the price, exactly. And actually, if you listen to interviews with leaders, like they're not, they have no regrets. Like they understand what they were getting into. But that was just that was effective at getting like one set of policies removed, getting the government to stand down. But I mean, there's so many other issues that.
But it had an impact globally, though.
We had a
if we're-
million we had a million immigrants come into this country in 2022. A million. 3.5% increase in our population, one goddamn year, and that's after year after year after year of a 1% increase in the population.
So I got a strategy for Canadians that they can employ. All right. So what you guys
become
can do?
become the 51st through 65th.
No. It's longer game than that. So what you do? There's this new policy, right, that allows you to join the U.S. military, get citizenship real quick. All right. So you come down here, you help us out, you help us restore American norms, and then work to apply diplomatic pressure to Canada. In order for them to quit being, a socialist.
Well, this is why as a Canadian, I'm fairly invested in America getting its shit unfucked because, not just that you're a pretty powerful country and that would be good for the world, but also, frankly, like we need America leaning on Ottawa real hard to get its shit together. And right now, it's quite the opposite. Like America's just like happy to let Canada spiral off into liberal insanity, because that's Washington's official policy too. Canada's just 3 steps ahead, as a laboratory for rainbow liberalism. So yeah, but I mean, like, at least you guys are able to have this conversation in a serious way and really think about these things as an actual possibility. Um, as bad as things are in the US, I think we saw this during the coronavirus as well, where, with the exception of a couple of countries like Sweden and like Belarus, like every Western and European and Euro-colonial country on the planet just went full retard, went full koala bear on, like, uh, on all of the COVID mandates. In the US, it was like some states did, the government did, but a lot of states didn't, because you still have this strong federalist thing there. So you get a lot of Americans, they're like, oh, like, we're so screwed, like it's such a tyranny here, and there's an element of truth to that. The blue states really are that way, but because of the federal structure, they haven't been, and because of the Second Amendment, frankly, I think it's a huge factor. The government has not been able to fully impose itself across the country, and that's whereas everyone else, like, we don't have a First Amendment, we don't have a Second Amendment, we don't have meaningful federalism. Like, little structural examples to compare between Canada and the U.S. For example, in the U.S., when a town incorporates, it owns itself basically. Like, the government can, obviously, like, state law applies, federal law applies, you have eminent domain, things like that. But fundamentally, like, the town runs itself. In Canada, you're basically renting crown land. And if the state decides that your town doesn't exist anymore, it doesn't exist anymore. So the province can come in and say, oh, we're going to amalgamate your township with another township. And there's nothing you can do about that.
Well, it's the same here now, though, after Kilo versus New London. Like, we had a decision 20 years ago where it was eminent domain became hyper powered, supercharged, where they just said, like, well, guess what? Like, these new developers that are coming in, they're going to bring in more tax revenues than your little hamlet will. And so the Supreme Court at the time, which was of a different composition, said, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, it's like, get more a bigger tax base off of, like, some kind of a development scheme that included a bunch of commercial properties. They said that's enough. This is 25 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, like, we're in the same boat.
You guys also have sheriffs, so you actually can elect your own law enforcement people, and they're accountable to you. But Luke, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah. We thought, let's close it, and I mean, maybe we can still do a part 2 if we feel like. I think there's still a lot to be said. Let's talk about it. But yeah, just as my kind of closing remark again, I think it was really fascinating to hear what you guys talked about. I'm a bit of an outsider here as a European satellite state of the empire, but I think I think all of these different avenues that you guys described are really worth pursuing, and I totally share Grant's like stance that we should never exclude possibilities right from the get-go. I mean, reality is just too fluid and too crazy. I mean, for all we know, like, elections can change everything. I mean, it's not like guaranteed, obviously, but who knows? And the same thing goes for other strategies, right? For other things we can do. But ultimately, my kind of take is that all of that might be successful, and that's great, right? But even if it's not, and to be honest, I don't see a lot of solutions that don't involve things getting worse first before they're getting better. But even so, like, even if that's the case, this is all like crucial training for whatever might come, right? Because again, I think we just don't realize how not ready we are, for all kinds of stuff. I mean, imagine just, like, I don't know, like, from bank runs to, like, sparse food, drinking water, like financial collapse, and I mean, violence, whatever. It's like there's just so many things that can go down, and that's why, I think it's super important the way the Harrison's work, for example, like just to learn about the psychological issues that are like universal, right? And they play themselves out during like revolutionary moments, during crisis, things like that. Like there's stuff to learn, and even like what I'm trying to do, the more philosophical, spiritual angle, like thinking about that kind of stuff to have a wider perspective and all of that, and also like the practical stuff, right? The training ground, trying all kinds of avenues, thinking about it, like being smart, being mature about it, doing things. All of that is, I see it, as worthwhile, no matter what happens, even if shit goes down pretty hard. That's our only way, if we are prepared on all fronts and not fall, for the next stupid revolutionary, like who makes things worse, or like getting involved in or entangled in all kinds of stupid games, and then end up with the wrong leaders, and all of that stuff, or just to survive, like frankly. So yeah, so that's kind of my closing remark, and yeah.
All right, with that, we'll close it out. Yeah, we might do a part 2, because this is fertile ground, and it's fun when we don't all like 100% agree with each other. I think we all agree with each other way more often than not, so it's fun when there's some things to really discuss. But thanks y'all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.